On the display, more than half the Kyrath fleet had begun to turn. Not scatter, not flee. Turn, bows swinging away in formation, deliberate, like a door someone had finally decided to close. Nobody spoke on the bridge. Captain Sarina Thorne tapped her ring finger twice against the arm of her chair, an old habit, and watched 30 years of unbroken conquest reverse itself in real time. "Confirm," she said. 2 syllables, nothing more. "Confirmed, Captain." Commander Mercer's voice was flat, the way it got when he didn't trust what his own screen was telling him. "They're not regrouping. They're leaving the system." The wrong detail was small. On a fleet that had never once retreated, the Kyrath ships were leaving in perfect order, no panic, no stragglers, every hull holding its assigned spacing like the retreat had been rehearsed. Thorne noticed it and filed it away. She'd think about what that meant later. Right now, there was a fleet to watch off her scopes. An hour ago, this had been an SOS from a colony nobody in the Concorde had time for. A relay officer 3 systems away had read one line typed by shaking hands and made a decision that wasn't his to make. 18 hours after that signal reached him, one battlecruiser, human-built, human-crewed, 680 souls aboard, had done what the Concorde's entire response network could not. It hadn't sent aid. It had sent the retribution. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She did not wait for an answer. "Expansion Master," Thorne said into the open channel, and the bridge went still enough to hear the recyclers hum. "You have 4 hours before the Concorde fleet arrives behind me. I'd retreat too." The channel held silence for 42 seconds. Then the last of the Kyrath ships came about and ran. "I'll be honest, I didn't think we'd get here in 18 hours. Stay with me. It gets worse before it gets good." 18 hours earlier, none of this had a name yet. It was just a signal, sitting in a queue, waiting for someone tired enough to almost delete it. Duty Officer Velthon had processed 40 distress calls in 8 days. Most were fuel requests dressed up as emergencies, or border disputes some captain wanted the Concorde to referee. He worked through the queue with his eyes half shut, tagging, forwarding, closing. The relay station's night shift ran on recycled coffee and the particular boredom of watching a screen that almost never mattered. The signal from Verath Colony Cluster looked like all the others at first. Standard header. Standard distress code. He'd already moved his hand toward the delete key when he caught the line underneath the formatting, not typed by the automated system, but by someone using the manual override, someone who didn't have time to fix the 2 typos in it. "Please, they are killing everyone. We have children here." Velthorn sat back. He read it again, slower. He pulled the origin tag. Verath Colony Cluster, Sector 9 Fringe. 3 worlds, tight orbit, over 4 million people between them, a shield grid 30 years old, and never meant to stop what was now sitting outside it. He pulled the threat classification next, and his stomach dropped before the screen even finished loading. Kyrath Expansion Fleet. 14 colony clusters consumed in 30 years. 0 survivors reported at any of them. He checked the Concorde response board. The nearest asset was 6 days out. He checked the Kyrath fleet's approach vector and ran the colony's shield decay against it. 18 hours. Not 6 days. 18 hours, and then the math stopped being a projection and became a fact. Velthon had a protocol for this. The protocol said escalate through channels, log the timestamp, wait for authorization. The protocol was built for a galaxy where 6 days was an acceptable answer. He looked at the line again, "We have children here," and understood that the protocol was going to get every one of them killed while it worked exactly as designed. There was one species with no formal treaty, no jurisdiction requirement, and ships fast enough that the distance might not matter. The Concorde called them Deathworlders, not as an insult exactly, more like a warning label nobody had bothered to soften. Velthon had never sent a contact request to a human vessel. There was no button for it. He built one from 3 different forms and hit send before he could talk himself out of it. 4 minutes and 17 seconds later, something answered. Not a form response, not an auto-acknowledgement. A live channel, opened on the other end by someone who had apparently been sitting close enough to catch it the moment it landed. "This is the UES Retribution." A woman's voice, unhurried, already awake in a way that suggested she hadn't been asleep to begin with. "Send the full packet, all of it." Velthon sent it. On his screen, a status window showed the packet being read, not skimmed, read in under 3 seconds. Nobody read 4 pages of colony data and shield telemetry in 3 seconds. He was still processing that when she spoke again. "What class of fleet?" "Kyrath expansion fleet, ma'am. 56 confirmed hulls on approach, Ravager class majority." Silence, not confused silence. The silence of someone doing arithmetic she'd already done once before, a long time ago, and was only confirming. "I don't have Concord authorization to cross that border," Velthon said, because it needed to be said by somebody. "I'm a duty officer. I can't grant that." "You just did," the woman said. "Say so, and I'll go. Say no, and I still won't be able to make myself sit here." He looked at the queue behind this signal. 40 more distress calls he'd tag and forward and forget by morning, and thought about the 2 typos in a message from someone who'd had maybe 90 seconds to write it before the line went out. "You have it," Velthon said. "I'll face whatever comes after." "Good man." A pause, and something in her voice shifted, settled, like a decision locking into place. "Retribution out." The channel closed. Velthon sat alone in the relay station's dim light, wondering exactly what he just unleashed, and whether Battlecruiser was even the right word for whatever the Deathworlders had been quietly building for the last several years. 2,000 kilometers away, on a bridge built for a crew that trained for exactly this kind of night, Captain Sarina Thorne closed the channel and turned to face 680 people who had no idea yet that their next 18 hours were already decided. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn leather journal, its spine cracked from 22 years of use. She opened it to a page she'd drawn 3 years earlier, a tactical diagram of a Kyrath engagement pattern, sketched from files nobody else had bothered reading twice, and set it on the console where Mercer could see it. "Battle stations," she said. "All of them. We have a colony to reach." Mercer had served with Thorne long enough to read her silences the way other officers read reports. He watched her set the journal down, watched her trace one fingertip along a diagram she'd drawn before either of them had heard the name Verath, and understood that whatever was coming, she'd already fought it once in her head. "Full briefing," Thorne said. "All hands. I'm not sanitizing the numbers." "Captain." "All of them, Mercer." She was already moving toward the corridor. "They deserve to know exactly what they signed up for tonight." The Retribution was not the biggest ship Earth had ever built. That honor belonged to a fleet carrier somewhere in dry dock, 4,000 souls, and none of them meant to fire a shot in anger. The Retribution was built for one purpose, and everyone aboard her had chosen the posting knowing it. Ensign Lena Park had the helm before the general call even finished sounding. She was 26, flew like the ship was an extension of her own reflexes, and had a habit of grinning at bad odds instead of flinching from them. When Thorne stepped onto the bridge and said the words maximum drive output, "Don't touch the override limiters," Park's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief either. "You've been waiting for someone to say that," Thorne said. "Since flight school, Captain." Petty Officer Marcus Webb ran weapons with the calm of a man who'd stopped being afraid of his own console years ago. He didn't ask questions when Thorne called up the targeting geometry from her journal and had it loaded into the tactical grid before the briefing even started. He just studied it, nodded once, and began recalibrating the primary batteries to a firing solution nobody else on the ship had seen yet. In the mess hall, 680 people stood shoulder to shoulder and listened to their captain tell them the truth. "There's a colony at the edge of the fringe," Thorne said. 4 million people, give or take. A fleet that's never lost a single engagement is 18 hours from finishing what it started at 14 other colonies before this one. The Concord can't get there in time. We can. Nobody moved. Somewhere near the back, a young rating shifted his weight, the only sound in the room. "I won't tell you the odds are good," she went on. "I've read every file on this fleet's doctrine. I've spent 3 years deciding how to beat it. That plan is not a guarantee. It's a chance. If any of you want to stand down from combat duty, say so now, and no one will think less of you." Nobody spoke. Webb, standing near the front, said what the silence meant out loud. "Wouldn't be here if we wanted easy, Captain." Thorne held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the closest thing to gratitude she allowed herself in a room this size. "Then let's go to work." What the crew didn't know, what almost nobody outside a single classified program knew, was that the Retribution's official drive specs, the ones filed with the Concord and printed in every open registry, were polite fiction. The United Earth Navy had been sitting on a faster engine for years, waiting for a night that justified using it. Thorne had read the classified addendum the week she took command and never mentioned it to anyone who didn't need to know. Tonight, for the first time since the ship left dry dock, nobody was going to ask her to hold back. She spent the next several hours alone in the combat analysis room, journal open beside 3 live displays, building what she privately called the geometry. Not a plan so much as a shape the battle needed to take, worked out stroke by stroke the same way she'd worked out the original sketch 3 years earlier, back when the Kyrath was still a name in someone else's intelligence report, and not a fleet bearing down on a colony with her name attached to its rescue. Mercer found her there once, past the point where most captains would have handed the work to a staff officer and gotten some sleep. "You drew this before we ever heard of Verath," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I drew it because someday there'd be a Verath." She didn't look up from the page. "I just didn't know the name yet." "That's not preparation, Sarina. That's premonition." "It's arithmetic." She finally met his eyes. "The Concord takes days to respond. The Kyrath take hours to arrive. Someday that gap was going to kill people who didn't have to die. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to be the officer who found that out too late to matter." Mercer didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Outside the hull, the black kept sliding past at a speed no sensor outside the ship could properly track. Somewhere behind them, at a relay station he hadn't left since the signal came in, Veltham was staring at a status board that still read transmission accepted, waiting to find out whether the decision he'd made in the dark would end his career, save 4 million lives, or both. He didn't know yet that the fleet approaching Verath had a flaw of its own. The being who commanded it, a war master who had conquered 47 times without once being forced to retreat, had built his entire doctrine on saturation fire and patterns he'd already seen. He had never faced an opponent who refused to be where he aimed. War Master Vethkor stood on the command deck of the Sovereign Moor, 4 arms folded in the posture his species used for patience, eye clusters glowing a steady amber as his fleet closed on the 3rd colony, this cycle that had failed to understand the futility of resistance. His sensors flagged a single incoming contact, one hull, human design, and dismissed it before the analysis even finished. One ship. Deathworlders had no formal treaty, no standing fleet posture in this sector, nothing in his records that classified them as a threat worth altering course for. He gave the order to continue the approach unchanged. It was the last order of the campaign he would give without adjusting for something he couldn't classify. Aboard the Retribution, Thorne closed her journal and stood. "Time to intercept." 14 minutes, Captain, Park said. "Systems lighting up the sensors already. 56 hulls confirmed, not 53 like the old intel said." Thorne absorbed the number without a flicker. 3 more ships than expected changed the geometry, not the decision. "Then we'll disable 3 more than we planned for," she said. "Sound general quarters. Mercer, I want damage control staged at every junction before we cross into their range." "Webb," she looked at the weapons station, at the firing solution glowing on his screen, drawn from a diagram 3 years in the making. "Fire only where I tell you, not a second before." The colony's last transmission crackled through the comm a moment later, Not a distress call this time, but something worse in its own way. A status update, calm and exhausted, from an administrator who had stopped believing help was coming and kept broadcasting anyway, because it was the only thing left to do. Shield integrity failing. 11 hours until the outer defenses gave out completely. Children moved into the deepest shelters first. Thorn listened to all of it without a word. 18 hours they gave us, she said finally. We're going to beat that number by a lot more than anyone back at that relay station is expecting. She stepped toward the forward viewport, where the black had just begun to show the first pinprick smear of the approaching fleet, still too distant for the naked eye, but close enough that the tactical display had started painting 56 red icons across the grid. A wall of ships that had never once retreated, closing on a colony that had already started counting the hours it had left, with one battlecruiser standing between them and the math nobody thought could be beaten. All stations, report ready, Mercer said quietly. Report ready, I came back from every station in turn, voices steady, and underneath the steadiness, in every one of them, the particular silence of people about to find out exactly what their captain's 3 years of waiting had built them for. The first impact hit the outer hull before Thorn finished her sentence. Brace! Mercer's voice cut across the bridge as the Retribution shuddered, armor plating flaring white on the display where the Karath opening volley found its mark. Thorn didn't flinch. She'd expected the first strike to land, expected it, planned around it, built the whole geometry, knowing the ship would take a hit before it ever fired one back. Damage report. Superficial, armor holding at 94%. Mercer's eyes were already moving to the next screen. They're ranging us. Full volley incoming in 30 seconds. Park, execute the approach vector. Now. Park didn't answer. She just flew. The retribution came about at an angle no Kyrath, tactical computer, had a template for, not a straight run at the formation, not a flanking curve, but a corkscrewing dive that put the ship's narrowest profile toward the incoming fire and kept it there, shifting by fractions of a degree every few seconds so that no single volley found the same section of hull twice. Impacts rippled across the armor, in a rhythm that would have looked chaotic to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years drawing the pattern by hand. She's not slowing down, Webb said, watching the enemy formation. They don't know what to do with a ship that won't hold still. That was the whole point. Warmaster Veth Kor's doctrine, built across 47 conquests, assumed an enemy that would either flee or hold formation and trade fire like every other fleet he'd ever broken. The Retribution did neither. She kept coming, closer with every second, absorbing hits along armor plating, designed to shrug off exactly this kind of saturation fire, until she reached the one place in the Kyrath formation that Veth Kor had never needed to defend before. The gap between his lead squadrons, left open because no enemy vessel had ever survived long enough to reach it. We're inside their formation, Mercer said, and there was something almost disbelieving in his voice. Good, Thorn said. Webb, drive junctions, fire at will. The Concorde had documented the vulnerability 40 years earlier and filed it away, because the Concorde never fought the Kyrath. They arrived after the Kyrath, cataloguing wreckage and writing reports nobody acted on. Thorn had read that report in her second year of command and never forgotten it. Every Ravager-class hull had one structural weak point, the aft drive junction, a flaw baked into a design nobody had bothered to fix because nobody had ever gotten close enough to exploit it. Webb's first shot found it in seconds. The nearest Kyrath vessel lost drive power in a spray of venting plasma, tumbling out of formation before its crew had finished processing what had happened. The second ship took a hit before the first had stopped drifting, then a third. They're not adjusting, Webb said, disbelief creeping into his own voice now. They're still firing the old pattern. That was the flaw at the heart of Veth Kor's fleet, the one no amount of conquest had ever forced him to correct. He could not process tactical creativity. He had never faced an enemy who refused to be where he aimed, and so his gunners kept firing at where the retribution should have been, missing again and again as she cut through disabled hulls toward the next target and the next. On the Sovereign Moor, Veth Kor's eye clusters shifted from amber toward a deeper, angrier crimson. He gave the order to reform the formation, a maneuver that had worked flawlessly against 47 previous enemies. It required his outer squadrons to close inward, tightening the net. It also put 3 of his own ships directly into each other's firing lines. The first friendly fire strike happened almost by accident, a Ravager gunner tracking the Retribution's last known position and hitting the ship that had just moved into it instead. The second wasn't an accident. A disabled hull, drifting without power, drew fire from its own formation simply by being in the way. Within minutes, the tight net Veth Kor had ordered became a trap of his own making, his ships crowding each other, firing at ghosts, striking their own. Thorn watched it unfold on the tactical display with the particular stillness of someone watching a plan she'd drawn 3 years ago finally prove itself right. "Shields," she said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Verath's shield grid just ticked up, Park called out. The Kyrath bombardment ships pulled off the surface to reposition. First good news the colonies had all night. Thorn allowed herself exactly 1 breath before the next order. Secondary batteries target the bombardment vessels directly. The formation's degrading, the planet doesn't get to wait for it to finish. Mercer's damage control teams were sealing hull breaches faster than Thorn had planned for, moving through corridors that had taken hits meant for a ship half as tough. Somewhere below decks, a young rating who'd stood silent in the mess hall briefing hours earlier was now running fire suppression lines through a compartment that had lost gravity twice in the last 10 minutes, doing his job because his captain had told him the truth and he'd chosen to stay anyway. Aboard the drifting hulls that had once been Veth Kor's formation, something had started that no amount of doctrine could stop. The chain reaction Thorn had engineered wasn't a single moment of collapse. It was compounding, each disabled ship becoming an obstacle that produced 2 more. The Kyrath fleet destroying itself faster than the Retribution's weapons alone could have managed. That was when the wrong detail from the very start of the night finally made sense. Because none of this, not one part of it, was supposed to be possible against a fleet that size. And it was working exactly the way Thorn's 3-year-old journal sketch said it would, down to the angle of approach, down to the order she'd give Webb before she gave it. Mercer glanced at her once, in the middle of the chaos, and understood something he hadn't quite let himself believe until that second. She hadn't drawn this pattern as a hypothetical exercise. She'd drawn it because some part of her had always known a night like this one was coming for some colony at some hour, and she'd refused to let the answer be 6 days too late. Thorn reached into her jacket without looking, the way she had 100 times before 100 smaller engagements, and touched the worn leather spine of the journal resting there. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She just needed to know it was where it always was. "Captain," Mercer's voice had changed. Not urgent, something closer to disbelief settling into fact. "The War Master's ship just dropped out of the formation. He's opening a direct channel." The bridge went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet all night. 31 years of unbroken conquest, and no Kyrath commander had ever requested a direct channel to an enemy vessel mid-engagement. There was no protocol on file for what was about to happen on either side. "Put him through," Thorn said. "But not yet. Let him wait the way we waited 18 hours ago." She turned to the viewport instead, watching the tactical display paint the wreckage of a formation that had never lost, now scattered and burning and turning on itself, while somewhere down on the surface of a world she had never seen with her own eyes, 4 million people who'd spent the night moving their children into deeper shelters had just watched their shield grid climb for the first time since the Kyrath arrived. Behind her, the comm board blinked steadily, holding an open channel from the one commander in 30 years who had finally run out of patterns to fall back on. 30 seconds, Captain," Mercer said. "He's not closing the request." Thorn didn't move yet. She let the silence stretch, let the War Master sit inside it the way every colony he'd ever burned had sat inside a silence of his making, and for the first time all night, allowed herself something that wasn't quite a smile. Let him, she said. Let him learn what waiting feels like. Thorn opened the channel. Veth Kor's voice came through the translator, flat and unfamiliar, 4 decades of conquest compressed into something that almost sounded uncertain. Earth vessel, you have fought with something we do not have a classification for. We are requesting a halt to engagement, to discuss terms. The bridge held its breath. On the tactical display, what remained of a fleet that had never lost sat scattered and burning, disabled hulls drifting in a rough sphere around a colony that was, for the first time all night, no longer under bombardment. Thorn looked at the numbers she actually needed. Her own armor degraded across 7 sections. Ammunition reserves thinner than she liked. A War Master with less than half his fleet, still combat capable, and a Concord relief force that would arrive in hours, not days. The very gap that had almost gotten 4 million people killed now working, for once, in her favor. Expansion Master, she said, and her voice carried across the bridge calm and absolute, the voice of someone stating a fact rather than opening a negotiation. Let me explain your situation to you. She didn't raise her volume. She didn't need to. You have a Concord fleet arriving behind me before your ships could reach the colony again, even if you tried. You have a hull count that can't sustain what's left of this engagement. And you have me, still here, still armed, still between you and the people you came to kill. 42 seconds of silence stretched across the open channel. On the Sovereign Moor, Veth Kor's eye clusters cycled from crimson toward something duller, a color his own crew had likely never seen him wear. Retreat now, Thorn said, and you go home with the ships you have left. Stay, and you go home with none of them. That's not a threat, that's arithmetic. And I recommend it, on behalf of your crews who deserve to see their homes again, not on your behalf. You don't deserve the recommendation. No triad, no speech. Just 3 flat facts, plainly said, and a silence that followed them. Then the Sovereign Moor came about. One by one, the surviving Kyrath vessels fell into formation behind their flagship and turned away from Verath, running lights dim, the retreat as orderly and disciplined as everything else about a fleet that had built an empire on never needing to do this before. 31 years without a single withdrawal, and it ended not with a final battle, but with a captain who'd simply refused to be beaten by a pattern. They're going, Park said quietly. They're actually going. Keep the running lights on, Thorn said. Let them see we're still here the whole way out. She did not celebrate. She watched the last Karath hull clear the system boundary, then turned to Mercer, who was staring at her with an expression that had finally stopped being disbelief and settled into something closer to understanding. You knew this would work, he said. Not hoped, knew. I spent 3 years making sure hope wasn't required. She closed her hand briefly around the journal in her jacket, an old habit rather than a decision to open it. Damage report, Commander. Then get our people fed and our hull patched. We're not done tonight. Below decks, in a compartment that had lost gravity twice and a bulkhead once, the young rating who'd stood silent through the mess hall briefing sat against a wall with his suit torn at one shoulder, alive, breathing hard, staring at nothing in particular the way people do when they've just found out they were going to keep existing after all. 4 hours and 22 minutes later, the Concord Relief Force finally arrived, a Sarathi admiral's fleet, cautious and by the book, sliding into a system that had already been saved by the time they got there. The admiral would later describe what greeted him as the most significant tactical achievement by a single vessel he had observed in 40 years of service. He said it to a review board, in a report nobody outside the Concord bureaucracy would ever read. It didn't matter much to the people on Verath. They'd stopped counting on the Concord's arithmetic hours ago. Down at the Galveston relay station, Velthon hadn't left his post since he sent the transmission that started all of it. He'd expected a reprimand, a formal inquiry, maybe worse. Instead, a priority message arrived on his terminal near dawn, station time, forwarded from a UEEN command channel he didn't recognize. Officer Velthon, your escalation was correct. The Retribution's response saved an estimated 4 million lives. Commendation follows. Signed, Fleet Command. He read it twice. Then he went back to the queue because there were still 39 other signals waiting, and somewhere out there, someone else might be typing an emergency line with shaking hands, hoping somebody tired enough to read closely would catch it in time. On the primary surface of Verath, in a shelter 3 levels beneath what used to be a schoolyard, the all-clear finally sounded, and above ground, the sky held nothing but stars where a fleet had been. 3 weeks passed before the colony sent its last transmission. By then the Retribution's hull had been patched, her crew rotated through rest cycles they'd earned twice over, and Thorn had returned to the same quiet discipline that had carried her through the years before Verath ever had a name she knew. She was in the combat analysis room, journal open to a blank page, when Mercer told her the feed had come through. She watched it alone first. 800,000 children, or near enough that counting exactly stopped mattering, had been asked by their teachers to draw the thing they remembered most from that night. Most of them drew a ship, a rough shape against a field of black, some with guns firing, some simply hanging in the dark like a promise kept. One drawing, near the end of the feed, was different. A small figure with careful crayon strokes had drawn not the battlecruiser, but a single window on its hull, and behind the window, a tiny stick figure she'd labelled in careful, uneven letters, the captain who came. Thorn watched until the feed ended. She did not smile, not exactly, but something in her face loosened that hadn't loosened in a long time. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the journal, spine cracked from 22 years of use. Page open to the diagram she'd drawn 3 years before any of this had a name. Beside it, she wrote one more line, the ink slightly uneven from the ship's low hum vibrating through the desk. For the ones who send the signal. She closed the journal. Captain, Mercer's voice from the doorway. Patrol assignment just came through. Next sector over. Another fringe cluster. Same profile as Verath. No standing treaty. Concord response time listed at 5 days, 11 hours. Thorn slid the journal back into her jacket, the leather worn smooth in the exact place her hand always found it. Then we'd better not be 5 days away when they need us, she said, and walked toward the bridge. The Retribution came about, running lights dimming to the low pattern she used on patrol, and turned back into the dark between systems, listening, the way she always did, for the next signal somebody would send when they'd run out of other people to call.